Hello and welcome on The Barricades. This is a podcast produced by Eastern European journalists and academics. I am your host, Maria Chernat, and with me, as usual, is the co host, Bojan Stanislavski, a Bulgarian born Polish journalist. And today, with great honor, we invite to our microphones Professor Richard Wolff. Professor Richard Wolff is a famous Marxian economist, professor emeritus of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and currently visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School in New York. He taught at Yale, he taught at the City University of New York, and he wrote a number of very interesting books. So the list is very long, so I will now just say a few of them, the most recent ones: Understanding Marxism and Understanding Socialism, and the most recent, The Sickness is the System: When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. Professor Richard Wolff, thank you for being here with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And now to Boyan, who will ask the first question about the sanctions.
Right. Professor Wolf, I want to start with the topic, which is, well, on the one hand, of course, it seems to me to be the most important economic topic of the day. But on the other hand, it's also one of the most interesting phenomenon recently. That is Russia's resilience to all those sanctions that have been imposed on this country since February 24th. I think it's very important for many reasons. First of all, we have never seen an such an act of economic war. Last I checked, it was like about 13,000 different sanctions, 8,000 or 9,000 of which were were directed at the economic foundation of the Russian budget, of the Russian economy, basically. And Russia is a capitalist state. Probably not a typical capitalist state, with certain political differences. Obviously, when you compare Russia to, let's say, this cliche liberal democracies of the West, there are certain differences. There are also certain differences in economy in terms of the ownership, state ownership of major industries, strategic industries, if you like. But still, it is a capitalist country. Its economy functions on the basis of what is largely referred to as the free market. And had it been China, had China been the subject of such an economic attack, then I'd kind of understand its resilience in the sense that they have like planned economy, they have they plan large portions of it, of its industry, of its most important services, and they're able to manipulate it through political decisions. It is somewhat different in Russia, and I'd like you to please start off with explaining how come this unprecedented war has actually had the effect on the attackers, in particular on the European Union, where we are based, myself and Maria, and not on the attacked party. It's I don't know whether it's the first time in history that this kind of boomerang effect happens, but at least, but I'm sure it's the first time in history that it happens to such an extent. And it seems like the people who are imposing it, despite seeing the effect, which is direct, which is contrary to the one desired, they have no reverse gear. So, Professor Wolf, tell me what is it like? What is happening actually?
Well, I'm going to start at the most general historical level and then work my way down to the sanctions program because I think that's the way to understand it. First, let's begin by the environment that we actually face, and the environment we face can be summarized with three statistics that I want everyone to keep in their mind. In economics, we use the GDP, the gross domestic product, as a measure of the relative size and power and strength of an economy. Literally, it measures the total output of goods and services in a year that is achieved in each society. So the GDP in the most recent year we have numbers of Russia is $1.5 trillion US dollars. The GDP of the United States, which is leading the economic war against Russia, the GDP of the United States is $21 trillion. So please keep in mind that an economic war between the United States and Russia pits a $21 trillion economy against a $1.5 trillion economy. If you add Western Europe, the allies of the United States, particularly United Kingdom, France, Germany, those three, but others as well, then it's not 21 to 1.5, it's closer to 30 to 1.5 in terms of the size. This, in any other situation, would have been a very short economic warfare because all of the strength is on one side and none of it is on the other. In other words, I'm saying to you, keep in mind these numbers when I explain the rest of it. Okay, now the second point. We are in a situation in the world which is best summarized as follows. We are in the declining phase of US capitalism and the United States global hegemony or empire. And we are watching the rise of a new empire, and that is the People's Republic of China. Third statistic, I remember I promised you three, the GDP of the most recent year of China is roughly $15 trillion. So China and the United States are the dominant economic powerhouses in the world. And compared to that, Russia is a small footnote. You have to keep that in mind, otherwise you will misunderstand what is going on. The United States believed until a few years ago that somehow they could control the development of China so that it would never be a greater danger to them than Russia under the Soviet Union ever was. And remember, it may have been an enemy militarily, but the Soviet Union was never an economic issue or problem for the United States per se. There was only the risk that it could become the model for the rest of the world. And in effect, that's what China showed was the real danger, that it would develop somewhere else much more economically successful than it developed in the Soviet Union. And that was, I don't want to take away, that was partly the understanding of Mao and the other Chinese leaders that they had to take a different road or they would be as limited in their achievements as the Soviets had been. Okay. So the war that begins probably best described with Russia going into Crimea some years ago, and then the problem with Georgia, and now the problem with Ukraine. The problem here is that under the protection of the Chinese, which is really what is now happening, and again, I don't want to take away from any other player, but I want you to focus on the major story here. Under the protection of the alliance with China, Russia moves into the Ukraine. Under the protection of the Chinese, the Russians invade, they move into Ukraine, and the problem for the United States is it cannot respond. It can't because it's not politically possible here. It can't because it's afraid of the nuclear weapon issue, and that's an uncertainty that they do not want to engage. That there's really nothing much they can do since Russia is a much larger military and political force than Ukraine. They are going to watch, they thought, another Crimea, another Georgia. That this is going to be how this works. Then they got the idea in their minds that they could do something else. They couldn't stop the Russians very well in Ukraine. What they could do, though, is use this opportunity to fight against the rise of China. And because they've changed their attitude, they don't believe they could control China. You should be aware, if you're not, let me remind you, this is the biggest sanction war we've ever engaged in the United States, but it comes right after the attempt of the Trump administration to do the same thing to China. There was a trade war with China, a tariff war with China. That was considered the greatest sanction program, 100% failure. That did not work, didn't change China in any way that anyone has been able to pinpoint. In fact, it was an embarrassment, to tell you the truth. To recoup that failure, the idea became, let's use the invasion of the Ukraine to weaken an important ally of China. That becomes the plan. Weaken Russia, drag it out, keep it going so that it costs them enormous amounts of money, detracts them from projects all over the map that they can't now do because they have to focus on whatever may happen in Ukraine and so on. That becomes the strategy. And therefore, since you cannot use American troops, because that's not politically possible, you need to use Ukrainian troops and European money as much as possible to foment a long-term, exhaustive experience for Russia, roughly similar to what happened in Afghanistan, a long, drawn-out, weakening situation. Okay, so that is then the plan. Here's the problem. It is no more likely to succeed than the sanctions program against China was able. And the reason is very simple. There's too much wealth, too big a set of economies willing to refuse to go along with the United States. That's why I began with a declining empire. It cannot control the whole world as it has been trying to do for most of the last 25, 30 years. It took seriously the war against terrorism as a kind of license to organize the whole world. And they can't do it. And they can't do it because the Chinese are too successful, too big, too powerful, and too economically advanced. Therefore, the Chinese can help the Russians, which they are doing. But much more important than the direct help between China and Russia is the fact that the Chinese have become so powerful around the world as an economy that they give an incentive to India, to Brazil, and to countless other countries to not cooperate, basically, with the United States, to play the two against each other, to do something with the United States, but to also do something with China, in other words, they are willing now to work as a global economic alliance, and they're just not going to conform to what the United States wants. And in this situation, the United States leadership now has no idea what to do. It's important to understand, there is no policy here. The policy decisions got into this war, and they do not know now how to get out of it. And their greatest fear at this point is ironically you. Where will Europe go? And by Europe, I mean both East and Western parts of Europe. You are going to be paying the price. If you
Oh
freeze
yeah.
in the winter, if you have this wild inflation, if you have this energy problem, the question is, where are you going? If the elections in Italy last Sunday are any sign, the Americans have much to worry about because you have growing discontent in Europe with the suffering there, the inflation, now the crazy response here in the United States of raising interest rates, which add a whole nother layer of economic difficulty, which will affect the Europeans, who will either have to follow by raising interest rates, which their economies cannot stand, or else watch their currencies disappear with collapse, with all kinds of severe consequences for them in that way. So I think the answer is the United States miscalculated what the Russians would be able to do in the way of finding external help. And the external help is buying gas, buying oil, buying food, buying fertilizer around the world so that they could enjoy not only that they could sell, but that the very sanctions effort drives up the price of what they sell. It, I mean, here in the United States, we make a joke that the Russians figured out how to wage a war and at the same time get the rest of the world to pay the cost of the war that they're fighting. And you should
Yeah.
smile. The ironies are very rich, but it's a very serious business because, as I'm sure you know, when one empire goes down and another one replaces it, it is very, very difficult for the society that is going down. Here in the United States, there is still a desperate need to pretend that this isn't happening. It's what psychologists call denial. It's when we all know it. If a romantic relationship that's important to us begins to dissolve, we want to deny it. We have that moment when we say to our friends, "Did you all see what I couldn't see?" And they sadly nod their heads and say, "We tried to tell you. We tried to give you. We couldn't. We didn't want to hurt you." And all the things that's what we're going through. And you can see it when I speak here in the United States. I use the example of Britain.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know how this was done in Eastern Europe, but in the United States, we've just had 2 weeks of endlessly boring television about the funeral of a
Yeah, yeah,
queen nobody ever cared about or knew about or was interested in. The British who lost their empire a century ago, they still live in the fantasy of all of this pomp and circumstance about an old lady who died. It is but their economy is among the worst in the world, the British economy. It's a disaster. The logical thing would have been to take the money of that kingdom, that royalty, and use it to help the British people. They didn't. And the British people don't mind because, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but they want the ceremony because it's the last little bit of the empire they can imagine might maybe still be there. I go around the United States and I say, usually at the end of my talk, either we learn from the disaster of the British Empire or we are about to experience the exact same thing. 50 to 100 years of decline, decline, decline. Britain was able to save another few years by blaming Europe. That's what Brexit was, a massive distraction from the internal collapse of an empire, as if leaving Europe would solve it, only made it worse.
Right. Right.
Right.
Professor Wolf,
Well,
I just want to ask the kind of supplementary question to this. So everything you explained so far is basically about Russia being supported by China with a different economic model, and being also supported by many other countries around the world which didn't want to play ball with the United States.
Right.
And now the situation is that the West, or what the Russians refer to as the collective West, because it includes Eastern Europe, it includes Canada, America, Australia, Japan, I don't know, all the states
Right.
which are with the United States, they instead of actually being on the offensive, they've isolated themselves, and now they suffer from, you know, the boomerang effect of all those sanctions. And, you know, I got to tell you that, of course, I agree, and I'm to a certain extent, I'm even glad that something finally depends on us in Eastern Europe. All the crises happen here, and finally maybe we're going to have some say. But you know, for us, I think it's actually going, paradoxically speaking, it's actually going to be easier. And for the Russians too. Actually, the Russians, they seem to be, when you speak to people from Russia, you know, economists, journalists, you know, commentators, you know, which I've done extensively, they tell you that, you know, they are all astounded at their performance. They had no idea they can actually, you know, be that well under this economic attack. And
Right.
of course, they are prepared for the problems to come and all the rest of it. But, you know, the one thing about ourselves in Eastern Europe and about the Russians is that we've been through all kinds of economic hardships. Okay. So for us, whatever's coming, you know, food shortages, gas shortages, rationing of energy, rationing of electricity, you know, all those things, we've been through that. We've been through a civilizational downgrade in the beginning of the 90s and you know, during the 90s, basically. And you know, we will survive it one way or another. I'm just really worried about, you know, the people in the West who are, you know, and this is my subjective opinion, but I really think that the West has created societies which are very unfamiliar with discomfort. And you know, there's going to be a lot of discomfort now, and I'm really worried about how the Western societies are going to react to that. Because simply, you know, when you speak to, even we've had people like that on the program, like energy experts, people who write for Oil Price Com and so on and so forth, they simply say there is not enough gas in the world if you take the Russian gas out of the equation. So obviously, and what you said about the denial, like they don't think logically anymore. The elites in the United States, the elites in the West, they're just ideologically obsessed with the preservance of their hegemony and all the rest of it. So I'm thinking, you know, this is you know, the kind of conflict between the East and the West. And as you said, it's going to be a long conflict, and there could be many wars, and there could be many things happening with this United States, you know, the American empire going down. The question is only how it is going to go down, and whether all those people who are, you know, in charge right now are going to be smart enough not to do something ultimately stupid and just end life on Earth. Are you also afraid of this kind of you know, reactions or misreactions, if you like, on the part of the American establishment?
I think my answer is both yes and no. And let me explain why I think that. There are, first of all, I don't want you to go too far with what I said. I'm trying to give you a sense of the dominant mood or attitude or understanding. But there are in the United States at least two forces, if you like. And my guess is that you have similar things in all the Western European, not maybe the East, but the Western. There are two perspectives. Number one, there is a group of people who are in the elite, who are big corporate leaders, politicians, and so on, who kind of understand what may be happening. And they are slowly and painfully trying not to get lost in denial. And they're being helped because the denial is so grotesque among their colleagues. So they are emerging as another force. Um, if you're interested, you can look at something called the Abigail Adams Institute. It's at Harvard, which already tells you, because Harvard is a special institutions like Oxford and Cambridge in England, Harvard and Yale, and those places are big deals in this country. And if stuff is happening there, it's already at the top of the food chain of politics and economics. So, and they've invited me, even though I'm recognized as a Marxist, which is still in the United States scary idea. But they've invited me, and I've gone there and talked to them, and that tells you that they already want a little bit to hear the kind of thing they know they're going to get from me, more or less. And then a very different force, a massive, from below, bitter, angry mass of people. They're the ones who are feeling the discomfort you spoke about. They have now been feeling it for quite a while, because the decline of the American empire, I would argue, begins in the 1970s and 80s, is postponed for one generation by an accumulation of mass working class debt, the likes of which the world has never seen. Mm-hmm. Americans carry a level of debt I don't believe exists in Europe. It certainly doesn't exist in the rest of the world. Huge debts, which they cannot afford, which they cannot carry, but which they keep raising even more. And they are bitter about it. They're bitter that they're in debt. They're bitter that their standard of living is shrinking. I'm talking about the majority of the people in this country. They have experienced and are continuing to experience more and more discomfort. That would be bad, but it's made worse by the fact that there was no preparation for this. There was no ideological preparation. No leadership spoke about it. All presidents of the United States are required to promise that it will only get better. Nobody prepares anybody for difficulty. That's impossible. That's the benefit of having been an empire on the rise for the last century. That's what you get. You forget all of the things that were once there. You forget, and you're encouraged to forget. But the mass of the people are letting the people at the top know, you've got a really big problem. Because we have, after World War II, systematically destroyed the left. Communists, socialists, Marxists, anarchists, labor union activists, all of it. It is logical and not a surprise that an angry American working class goes to the right. It looks to the right to give them the explanation. So here come the explanations, which you will find familiar. Immigrants, the terrible. Look at Viktor Orban in Hungary. You know them as well as I do. You know them better than I do. So immigrants are one terrible thing.
Okay, gay people.
Yeah. Yes. If your energy prices go up, go and beat up a minority.
Absolutely.
Homosexual.
That's right. Suddenly, the gas tank in your car will fill up by the mere fact that you've hurt some child from Africa or Asia, or in our case, Latin America. But there are others. China. Mr. Trump was able to mobilize a great deal of excitement by attacking China. The Democrats, who are simply the Republicans who spell the words differently, the Democrats prefer to destroy Russia, to make Russia the evil, every distraction. And so we tell ourselves the story. I mean, you have to think what it means. The story of evil Russia. And by the way, Putin is now associated in the American mind with Stalin. In other words, large numbers of Americans, by the way, are not aware of the change inside Russia from the Soviet Union to the present. They will, if you ask Americans who is Putin, he is a communist. That's how it
Wow.
works. It
Wow.
doesn't matter. I mean, if you're an educated person, if you read the newspaper, no. But large numbers of people, all of this is the same. Socialist, communist, Russia, China, it's all
So they
one.
fear Russia also for ideological reasons because they tend to think that there's like, communism around the corner trying to.
Yes, Mr.
Oh wow.
Putin is a horrible dictator,
Oh yeah.
just like Stalin was. If
Mhm.
look, I'm an economist. I've written books about the Soviet Union, what happened there, and all the rest. They have no idea. They haven't. But you remember, there is no in the United States. There's no subtlety. I mean, they
Mhm.
don't know what China is, and they don't know what Russia is. They know that they're bad.
And they have to
Everything,
contain them.
absolutely. For example, I mean, try to understand. Here in the United States, we just came off of wars in Afghanistan, wars in Iraq, wars in Libya. In all of those cases, the United States killed large numbers of Muslims. But we are horrified that the Chinese mistreat the Uyghur Muslim people in one small corner of that country. We are angry at Russia for invading another country. We just invaded Afghanistan. We invaded Iraq. I mean, the ability to not be, how shall I put it, ashamed or to be self-conscious that you are really, I mean, you look ridiculous in what you're
Yeah.
doing. No, 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 no. And by the
So
way, I have to face when I try, and I'm not a partisan of Mr. Putin, not at all. It has nothing to do with me. I have no doubt. But when I try to explain the absurdities here, my American audiences become very uncomfortable
Mhm.
because they want me to celebrate how wonderful it is that we are protecting Ukraine and against an evil, evil, evil Russia, evil, evil, evil. There are two great evils: Xi Jinping. Americans are learning how to say his name, and Putin. These are monster, as the French say, monstreux.
No.
It's just horrible, and it's childish, but it's the
Yeah.
reality. And believe me, I'm not sure where the American working class is going to go. It is already the case. Most Americans, look, the truth of it is, they don't care about Ukraine. They never did. They can't find it on a map. They have no knowledge of it. There isn't a big Ukrainian population here of immigrants, so we don't have that kind of thing.
Mm.
So then they like the distraction that the United States is protecting abroad. But when it is suggested that there's a link between that and the inflation that we have, because we have a bad one, and the
Right.
rising interest rates that are beginning to hurt the economy and push us into a recession, as the right wing working class makes that connection, they become a force to stop it. And then the question is whether the left wing, smaller because it has been isolated and
Suppressed. Yeah.
hounded for a long time, but it is growing quickly too. The new left that's emerging, and it's very important. There is a greater upsurge of interest in the left in the United States now than at any time since the Second World War. That has to be understood as well. You know, people like me have now the opportunity to speak in the United States all over the place. And that's because we have an audience, and that audience wants it and pays for it and invites it. So it is a dangerous time in the United States, and you're worried about oil and gas and heat and food, but we're worried about what we call here stagflation, a
Mhm.
recession combined with an increasing inflation and a population that is becoming angrier and more divided and more bitter literally every day.
I want to go now a little bit to probably a solution. You discuss a lot the possible solution, and that would be workers' co-ops to bring democracy at work, to stop allowing a small minority at the top to tell everyone else what to do.
Right.
And I asked this question and I come back to it. Now, of course, worker co ops are a very interesting idea, a very appealing one. But it is my firm belief that if you don't have at least some planning in the economy, it won't work. If you still maintain the competitive production of profit, if you still maintain this insane competition that made us all precarious, then you will end up with worker co-ops competing like crazy and self-exploitation being the new rule. Because if you don't have a planning that will work for the mass of people, then there is no way that worker co-ops alone will be the possible solution. And I was surprised by the very interesting case made by Lee Phillips and Mikhail Rozvorsky, who authored a very compelling and interesting book, The People's Republic of Walmart, where they discuss how big corporations are based on planned economy, basically, but the planning is for the benefit of the elites. And what we will have to do is to take that kind of planning and planning instruments and use it in a way to benefit everybody. So to have that type of thinking combined with yours, I would say, the perspective of Lee Phillips and Mikhail Rozvorsky with the planned economy and worker co-ops, at least it is my opinion that this project it is going to work having these two elements combined.
Well, my basic response to you is I agree pretty much 100%. And I accept some responsibility for having left people with the impression that my advocacy of worker co ops was, in some sense, a substitute for the older tradition in socialism and communism to focus on government planning, government enterprise, and all of that. I have always said, and I will fight about that. I've always said it is an addition. What we're trying to do is to ask the question, why didn't Soviet planning have a better result than it did? Why are the problems of China that come out of their planning? Why didn't it have the better result? And I'm not taking away from the fact that the planning in the Soviet Union was in many ways very successful, and the planning in China was successful. I remind everyone, since I'm a professor of economics and I'm supposed to know these things, that the fastest economic growth in 20th century capitalism was the Soviet Union. And the fastest economic growth in our century is the People's Republic of China. That ought to make you wonder, before we are so critical of what their planning system achieved, let's be clear on what it did achieve. Then we can make criticism, all the failures, all the mistakes. We have to learn, but we have to learn from what they achieved, and we have to learn from what they didn't achieve or where they failed. My advocacy is explained this way. Much was done that was good about having the government step in, mixing, which the Chinese have done better than the Russians, mixing the private and the public
Yes.
and all of that. But what they never did, neither of them, was radically transform the base of society, the microeconomic level, the enterprise, the factory, the store, the office, and by the way, the household also, because that's a place where production goes on, and the relationship between men and women and mothers and fathers is and belongs inside the story we tell. But the whole point was to add something. That's all. To add attention to the micro transformation, to what had been, in my judgment, an overemphasis, understandable in the history of the West, but an overemphasis on the top, on the macro level, on public versus private, state versus not state. I understand those are important issues, but they led to a neglect of the transformation, so that
Mm.
you got rid of the board of directors of a corporation in the West elected by shareholders, and you substituted state officials, a council of ministers, or whatever it was called. Council of ministers was what the Russians called their system. This is not enough. I mean, it's the parallel would be in a country in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that's a colony, and finally it rebels. It's no longer a colony. So instead of British people running India, you now have Indian people running India. You had to learn that that's not enough. If you want to get India out of being a colonial subordinate society, you got to do way more. Otherwise, you simply replace British capitalists with Indian capitalists. You're still stuck with capitalism. You have to go further. Now, last point. It is, an old argument in socialism. It goes back to the end of the 19th century that the modern capitalist corporation, when you get beyond the individual capitalist to the joint stock company and the big corporation, that they have learned machinery, technology, but also organized planning, and that the socialists can and will benefit from the planning mechanisms that have been developed in the capitalism before them. Just like capitalism benefited from a whole host of developments in the feudalism that came before capitalism. So absolutely, I teach corporate planning. I teach students how corporations, whether it's Walmart or it's Apple Computer or any of the others, they do an enormous amount of economic planning. Here's the irony that I enjoy. You might enjoy it too. In the West, capitalism is celebrated, wrongly in my opinion, but it's celebrated for being a free market.
Mm.
But if you talk to corporations, as I do, and you study their history, you will know that corporations are the assemblage of what we call here mergers and acquisitions, a history of buying other companies and integrating them. Why do they buy them? Here's the answer they give: because relying on the market is too uncertain. We don't want to rely on the market. We may not be able to get an input. We may have to pay too high a price for an input or not get enough when we sell. How do we control the uncertainties of the market? We integrate, we agglomerate, we buy the other company, and instead of a market relationship, it becomes an internal to the corporation planning process. When I teach that, they all know that. And I say, you're all afraid of socialism. All that socialism does is rationalize that process on a nationwide or a community-wide scale. They have no answer to this. They have no answer to this. And I say to them, if you want to show me that there are ways in which competition can be providing us useful results without bad ones, let's hear it. There's nothing in the socialist or the communist idea that I know of that precludes competition.
Mm.
When we decide who goes to the Olympics, it's the one who runs the fastest. We can work out a competition to find that person. If we see that as positive, if we make sure that we do not destroy the person who isn't the fastest runner, if we make sure we find useful social programs for them, then we can get the benefit of competition without the horrible waste of resources that capitalist competition has always spewed all over the place. And again, these arguments now can be made in the United States. When I was coming up I was born here in the United States, just me personally. So I'm a 100% American, born here. But my parents are Europeans, were Europeans. My father was born in France, and my mother was born in Germany. I speak French and German, and I always have, even though I was here. I went to Harvard and Yale. Those are the schools I attended. I am a product of the elite education. My classmate at Yale getting our PhD was Janet Yellen, who's the current Treasury Secretary. We sat in the same room, listening to the same professor, reading the same books, and going and having coffee. It's a different, and I know these people. They are terrified. They don't know what to do. They don't know where to go. Their performance as being in charge in the traditional way is exactly the equivalent of the funeral of Queen Elizabeth. These are theater pieces designed to keep an exploding reality from blowing up tomorrow. Hold it off, make it all look like it. We are about, by the way, this is very serious and will affect you. We are about to raise interest rates in this country. We're already doing it. We are not going to defeat the inflation. I don't think so. Every sign I see indicates it will continue. There are now growing numbers of people who agree with this, and I mean people who are right wingers and in the middle, not just lefties. So we're going to have both a recession and an inflation, that is stagflation, we call it here. And we're going to have a very serious political crisis all at the same time. And I'm telling you, we are all here, and I hope you are there, beginning to wrestle with the fact we may be in for some very difficult times. And the election in Italy, like so many other signs, should be understood in that context, as is the failure of the sanctions program in terms of Russia.
Absolutely, I think it's absolutely correct to say that what happened recently in Italy is obviously the indicator of how things are going to be unfolding in Europe. And this is, as a leftist, as a socialist, communist, like I'm not so happy about the way things are unfolding, because obviously those are our political enemies, and things are very unpredictable when they come to power, and all kinds of horrific things could happen. I'm not saying that this will necessarily happen, because we don't know, obviously, and it's very difficult to predict. But this is also the product of the last 30 years of devastating and destroying the left. And I'm talking about the capitalist class, the new capitalist class in Eastern Europe, and the old traditional capitalist class in the West, together with the media syndicate, basically doing everything in order to strip the left of any agency, any meaning of existence, and so on and so forth. And for the last 30 years, all the societies in our region in Eastern Europe have basically been offered one right-wing alternative, one right-wing program after another. And this is where it finally got us. People are actually starting to vote for spontaneous, real, right wingers, not just this festival of fakery that we've had for all those years. But Professor Wolf, I want to ask you about the question of inflation, because you mentioned that twice already, in our program today, and I think it's very important to push back against the general narrative, because as you said, there's so much narrative-based thinking now, and it's becoming more and more massive. I mean, as you said about like people thinking that Putin is a communist or something like that in America, and perceiving him as like the impersonification of evil, and all this nonsense, which is ludicrous on its face, by the way. But the narrative here in Europe, and in Eastern Europe in particular, I would say, is that it's of course, on the one hand, it's Putin's fault, because everything is Putin's fault. If your refrigerator breaks down, it's also Putin's fault. Everything is like this. But then there's also, there is also they also there always has to be this pinch of professional anti-communism on the part of the elites here. They have to do that, because otherwise, it's like they just can't help themselves with, and. They say that it's unfortunate, it's very unfortunate, but part of the responsibility is on the United States, because even in the United States, which is such a great place, capitalist heaven, and and all good things, right? Even there, sometimes some leftist policies are being applied, and unfortunately this very bad leftist policy of money printing. Now, I personally have no idea what money printing has to do with leftism, but this money printing, socialist communist money printing, that's what they've done. And because of that, also because of that, except for Putin, the world has to suffer, and we have to suffer. So I'd like you to, Professor Wolf, to please push back against this,
Yes,
leftist
yes, I
communist
think
money printing. Yeah.
it's very important, because also in Romania they don't think that all the Americans are doing it, but also the Romanian government, because they raise pensions, and because they show some, they care about some people, and this is leftism, and this is bad, because they should just leave everybody to die, and be as cruel as possible. So this is a sign of weakness. Any kind of social policy is seen as a kind of weakness. And also, um, it is something that would lead to even worse results. So we have to be very careful with those policies.
Right. Yes, we have that here. But in case it's any comfort to you, this is very old. The effort to keep the government from taking care of people is a right-wing religious commitment, and they are good. They go to church on Sunday and they perform their religious duties, and they always find some reason why you shouldn't spend government money helping the mass of people. And the reason for that, in my humble opinion, and I'm not humble, but in my humble opinion, uh, their terror is that the mass of people will like this, will want this, and that eventually will tax the rich to pay for it. And
A horrendous perspective.
a
Horrendous.
horrendous perspective, which, remember, happened here in the United States in the 1930s. The greatest crash of capitalism produced a massive movement to the left in the United States. That's why we had this thing called the New Deal. Remember, we created Social Security, the first public pension. We had never had that before. We created unemployment compensation. We never had that before. The government hired 15 million people to do socially useful work. We've never had that before or since. We passed the first minimum wage. In a period where the government had no money, where we had 1/4 of our people unemployed, we spent money to create social programs on a scale we had never done before. And that's in the minds of at least the older people. They kind of know that this can happen. All right, now my response. Here's the response that I give, and I have pretty good success with it. It goes like this. What the government does with money, or spending or not spending, or lending to the banks or whatever, and I exaggerate because I have to make the point hard, makes no difference. It has nothing to do with an inflation. You have to break the logic in their mind. How do I then take it the next step? I say, I'm now going to give you a very brief economics lesson, but it is true and it is irrefutable. How do you get an inflation? And remember, I'm talking to you American audiences, but it wouldn't be that different anywhere else. In the United States, there's only one way to get an inflation. An inflation is a general increase in prices. Who sets prices? Answer: employers. Employers in the United States are less than 1% of our population. So a group of people who are a tiny minority are the ones who are the CEOs or the board of directors or the owner of the enterprise. They're the ones who decide whether the price goes up, goes down, or stays the same. And then I appeal to my audiences, just in case you want to enjoy the mechanism. I say, you and I are employees. I can tell you, not once in my life has my employer ever asked me to participate in deciding whether the price should go up, down, or stay the same. And you all, and I look at them, you all know you've never been involved in the process either. So the first thing to understand about an inflation is who is responsible. And the answer is the employer class of our society. There is no answer to this. There is no refutation. I have debated, the most famous economists you can think of. They stand there looking at me. Now I take it the second step. Why do employers raise prices? Because that's our problem. We have an inflation because they're doing it. And I answer, well, I have taught in business schools, and I can tell you what we teach employers. Every decision you make as an employer, whether to hire workers, whether to buy a new machine, whether to open a factory in another country, all your basic decisions have to be focused on one thing. Does it enhance the profitability of your business, or does it do the opposite? If it lowers your profitability, don't do it. If it enhances your profitability, you ask a second question. Is this the best I can do in terms of enhancing my profitability, or is there still something else? So the only honest answer to the question, why are the employers raising prices? The answer is to make more profits. That's why they do it. If they didn't make more profits, they wouldn't do it. There is no answer to this question. Now I say, let me show you. Between the year 2000 and the year 2020, that is the first 2 decades of this century, the United States government pumped more money into the economy than at any other time, peacetime, with the exception of World War II. We pumped money in. Did we have an inflation? No inflation at all. Over the last 2 years, the government has pumped money in like it did before, and we have an inflation at least over the last 12, 18 months. Obviously, therefore, if you have a scientific brain, if for 20 years extra money produced no inflation, but in 2 years extra money did, then it isn't the extra money that's the issue, is it? No answer, no refutation. So now I'll explain. In the first 2 decades, the extra money that the government pumped in went into where it was most profitable. Businesses, banks, they're the ones who get the money the government pumps in. They did not think the profits would be in producing more goods and services. Why? Because the inequality in the United States has destroyed the middle class, which is true. And so there isn't a market for more goods and services. People can't afford them. They can't borrow anymore, and the wages have gone nowhere. Therefore, the money went into the stock market, because buying shares and then selling them 2, 3, 4 months later gave you a capital gain, and that was the most profitable way to use the extra money. And the people in this culture here in the United States believed that because the stock market was doing well, capitalism was doing well. Big mistake. What happened was the prices of the stock market between 2000 and 2020, 21 went up so far that you were beginning to frighten the people who play in the stock market that these elevated prices could come down, and then they could come down quickly and you could be hurt. I now have, of course, the wonderful opportunity to then show them a graph of what has happened to stocks in the United States since the January of this year. It is a catastrophe. The American stock market is down 25 to 30%, and it is everywhere else too. So what they were afraid of, they then, typical, brought into being because they began to sell. And that meant the money coming in wouldn't go to the stock market because that was not the place to make money. Where is it going? Yeah, into the regular economy where it is bidding up the price of goods and services that haven't been produced here for 20 years because the money went. So I've done it. I've explained in this narrative that blaming the government for pumping the money supply up is, and I end my speeches this way, it's stupid. You're not being clever. You're being stupid. And I just showed you, and I've done a better job in 10 minutes explaining this than what you get every morning in the New York Times, which they know. It's pure right-wing propaganda to suggest that having given unemployed workers an extra few $100s during the pandemic is the cause of the inflation, which is what the right wing enjoys doing. And I said, that's just an effort to save you from the terror that one day you'll be taxed. That's all you are. You're telling something that is stupid, and you ought to be ashamed of yourself. You're trying to hide what you really are, about which you should be more ashamed. And in fact,
Right.
this is what is going on. Now, but let me answer another question here. It isn't difficult to do this. And it isn't difficult to do this in a variety of ways. And I would love to work with you as I work with other people to develop the counter narratives so that we have them available and we can distribute them and people need them. I agree with all of that. But there is another issue here I want to get across. And I can see we have time troubles. The right wing, and that includes Trump, or the right wing in this country, or that crazy woman in England that just took over from the even crazier man who was there before. And now the crazy woman in Italy. I don't mean to pick on the women. They are absolutely no worse than the men in any of this. They have no solution. In other words, beating up immigrants isn't going to solve your problem. We've been excluded. Here's the joke in America. For the last 5 years, 6 years, we have been throwing immigrants out of the country. It began, by the way, in case you're wondering, under Obama. It continued worse with Trump, and it now continues with Biden. It is a bipartisan anti-immigrant. The only thing funnier than imagining that in a country of 325 million people, the US, undocumented immigrants, maybe 10 million, if that, are the cause of the difficulties of an economy that's global and has 320. It's so stupid that I can make fun of it. But more important, it solves nothing. You know what we have in the United States today? What we say we have? A labor shortage. And you know where? At the lowest levels, the entry-level jobs, the low-wage job. We have a labor. After 6 years of expelling, you know who? The immigrants who did those jobs are gone, and and the country is worried about the labor shortage. You know, my audiences begin to laugh, even my right-wing audiences, that it is so crazy that it becomes easy for us. They have no solutions. And you know, as each week passes, that's what undid Boris Johnson in England. Not the fact that he was a liar, which he always was, or that he had parties in Downing Street when you were supposed to be at home with the pandemic. That was the end. He fell because everything he proposed didn't work. Brexit did not rescue the British economy. The opposite. And Trump, part of what happened to him was there's no solution here. By the way, Mr. Biden, he's got no solution either.
Mm.
What we have, we actually have something. If we identify capitalism as the problem, if we identify developing a national plan together with a transformation of the workplace, these are exciting new ideas. I come in with my worker co-op, and I don't mind telling you, part of the reason is strategic. They know I'm a Marxist, a socialist, and all of that. They expect me to talk about the government. I don't. I surprise them. I talk about changing the job. How would you feel if you were part of the leadership of your office or your store or your factory? If you didn't have to bargain with an employer who's always looking for some way to get more work out of you and to pay you less. Suppose we reorganized it. Your going to work in the morning would be a pleasure instead of a horror. You would find it a place to develop your capabilities rather than to watch the distance between your education and all you dreamed for on the one hand and the stupid job that you have here now. And as I talk, I can see it. I've been a teacher all my life. I see it in their faces. I have something to tell them. I'm not persuading everybody. I don't claim it. But we actually have some concrete ideas about how to make things better.
Right. I think it's very inspiring what you just said. And Professor Wolf, for the very end, because I understand you have to go shortly, I want to ask about the kind of political leverages that could be used even under capitalism to suppress inflation, because everybody says that, oh, inflation can only be stopped if you reduce the demand. And this is the only way to do that, and so on and so forth. And I think there's also a political way to act, which I think, by the way, is also American experience. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, it was during the times of Nixon. Or when he just put together the entire business elite, the capitalists, and said, don't raise the prices or I'll lock you up. And they didn't raise the prices. And,
Absolutely.
So, I mean, it's not such a difficult thing to do, right? Even under capitalism.
I give two examples, and you can use them as well because they have equivalent. In Europe, for example, it used to be called an incomes policy. In the United States, it was called a wage price freeze. It's August 15th, 1971. The president is a conservative Republican named Richard Nixon. He gets on the radio and I remember I listened to the speech. I was alive. I listened to the speech. He said, if you're a business, as of tomorrow morning at 8:00, if you raise the price of any good or any service that you produce and sell, we will come to your business, we will arrest you, and you will go to jail. And by the way, if you're a union or you're a worker and you demand or push for higher wages, we will do that to you. It is a freeze of the prices, a freeze of the wages. It was originally set to go for 90 days. It was so successful, it was extended. It is credited with enabling Nixon to win the next election, to stay as president. He then destroyed everything with his Watergate and all of that crap, because he was we say here in the United States, he was a used car salesman and should have been treated that way. It would have been a useful way to spend his life. But so the question, can you stop an inflation without raising interest rates? Yeah. You know how? Because we've already done that. And the important thing to expose now, and I have great success when I speak about it, why would a government today not even raise the issue? There's no debate. There has been no debate in the United States Congress about what Nixon did. It is as if we have carefully cultivated a political amnesia about it. But there's a better example. It's World War II. It's the early 1940s. The United States is about to enter the war. Advisors to the then president, a Democrat named Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, advisors who later became my professors. That's how I know this story. They went to him and they said, we are about to enter the war. We're going to be shifting factories and railroad and to do war material. We're producing bombs and guns and ships and airplanes and all of that. And these resources that used to be producing consumer goods are now going to be producing war material. And that means here we go now. Think about the parallel with right now in Europe with oil and gas. We're going to have a sudden shortage of consumer goods because we are producing for war. If we allow the market as an institution to continue, my professors told the president, you're going to see rich people bidding up the price of all the shortages that are going to happen. And poor people and middle income people are going to watch as they are priced out of the market. As the prices go up, they can't pay for it. Do you really want to fight a war with Nazi Germany and Japan and all of that, with a country divided violently between the rich who will get the shortage materials and the mass of your people? This would be so stupid, you couldn't possibly do it. Agreed, said President Roosevelt. And I don't know if you know this part of history. The market was pushed aside. That institution we're supposed to pray to twice a day was pushed aside. The government printed, they were called ration books. And in each book, there were little stamps that you pulled out, the way you pull out a postage stamp for the mail. And if you wanted to buy at the store any one of the rationed items, which I'll give you in a minute, you paid for it with a ration ticket, not with money. Any storekeeper who sold you anything for money alone would be arrested and put in jail, violating the law of rationing. What was rationed? Meat, gasoline, sugar, coffee. I could go on long. Many, all dairy products and so forth. A huge amount of output. And we went on for years with no market. And the reason? To prevent an inflation of the goods that would be in shortage. Just like the wage price freeze was meant to stop an inflation. There was not one word of conversation publicly in the United States about either the Roosevelt experience of the early 40s or the Nixon experience of the early 70s. That tells you about a society that is now gone. It can't function. It can't even debate how to handle what everybody says is the number one problem. It's as if the hysteria was now socialized.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I think we've really departed from the Enlightenment so far away that it's kind of, it's very difficult for people to even think rationally. And for me personally, when I approach any major topic, then I always look first for people, not so much whether they are right wing or left wing, but whether their thinking is fact based or narrative based, and then we can have or we cannot have a conversation, I suppose. Anyway, Professor Wolff, I want to thank you very much for all of your insights and your explanations and all the examples you brought up. I want to tell you that you said it that you have enormous following in the United States and probably in many other Western countries. But what is important for me to emphasize is that you have a huge fan club in Eastern Europe, a huge fan club. And this is, your videos are translated most notably into Bulgarian. I mean, I personally know people who do that. Like they literally translate every appearance on YouTube wherever you go, they just put the Bulgarian subtitles on it. And for the Bulgarian left, you are absolutely the hero. I mean, everybody looks up to you, but all across Eastern Europe, in many places, including Russia and so on and so forth. So I just want to say that it would be really, really fantastic to start getting your work, closer to our audience. In a sense, your books starting to get translated. Also, appearances. I think we are making, a small, humble step in this direction because we are an Eastern European-based media, and we, most of our audience is from and around Eastern Europe. So I think it's gonna, it's going to encourage perhaps this process, and maybe in the future when things start getting better, if it ever happens, I very much hope so. Then maybe we will be able to organize even events with you, not only online events, but hopefully like some sort of tour in Europe and in Eastern Europe. That would really be a fantastic prospect. Once again, Professor Wolf, thank you very much. It was a great honor and a pleasure to have you on our show, and I hope you are prepared. You would be willing to come on our show again. I personally would love to be able to discuss with you, someday, the question of what went wrong with the Soviet planning, or what is potentially not so great with the Chinese planning today. The drawbacks of the Soviet Union and their economic structure, and the kind of the modality of planning that we would like to preach, to put forward to the leftists all around the world. I think that would really be a fantastic program. Once again, thank you.
Well, all I can tell you is I'm flattered and pleased to hear it. I would be very glad to connect you with the people that work with me. If you want to make use of the books or the videos, I can facilitate that. The woman who is in charge of that for us actually lives and works in Rome, in Italy. She's closer to you than you might know. She's excellent at all of this kind of work, and she would be glad to collaborate, to facilitate, help you in the translation, whatever we can do. And I would be glad to do this more often with you. I do this all over the place. The Zoom makes it very convenient. I don't have to travel. I don't lose all the time. So these or the equivalent, I believe in this. This is what I want to do. This is what I enjoy doing. I should tell you too, for all your audience, so there's no mistake. Because my parents were Europeans, and because of my good luck, and that's really what it was, luck. When I went to the fancy American universities, I went to Harvard, then I went to Stanford. That's another one that's on the West Coast in California. And then I finished at Yale. So I'm like a poster boy for the elite education here. I went for 10 years to those schools, 2 semesters a year, 20 semesters. Only in 1 semester out of 20 did I have a professor who gave me anything anti-capitalist or critical of capitalism to read. And most of that was Marx himself. And I want it clearly understood. I've had to learn conventional micro and macroeconomics and monetary economics and all of that. And from many of the people who, if you study economics, all got Nobel Prizes and became famous, because that's who gets hired at these fancy universities. But my great luck was that I found individuals, older and also my own age, and together we read and studied Marx. If what I have to say strikes you as insightful or useful, I want you to understand the credit goes to Marx. That's where it comes from. That's where these insights originate. Ultimately, the loss to the United States from repressing and suppressing Marxism will come back to haunt this country, because they don't have any of the capabilities. And you should see their faces when I give a talk and they end up very politely applauding me here in the United States at a university. And then I say, thank you very much for the applause. I really appreciate it, which I do. But I want you to understand what you really like here is an example of applied Marxism. You could hear a pin drop in the audience. They have the sad reality. They don't know what I'm talking about. They can't make that connection. And I tell them that. I said, I know you can't understand this, but it's going to stay in your mind that I said such a thing because you've never heard anyone you've applauded for do that. You're missing out on an incredible achievement, not just Marx, but the whole Marxist tradition that he inspired. There are insights there you can't get anywhere else. And you would be better at what you do if you gave yourself to learning what you should have been taught.
Well, I think that's very important what you said. At the same time, I would emphasize that, of course, it is so important to go back and to read Marx, but it is also important to have the ability to amplify the message and to amplify the message for a large audience. This is also important, and I think this is where your ability really stands out. So thank you so much for being here with us, and to the audience. I hope you like the show, and to the extent you feel you can afford it, please go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/the barricade. This is where you can find it. And Professor Wolf, thank you again for being here with us, and we hope to see you again on our program.
I hope so too. And all the best to both of you.